Welcome to the channel Learn with Danish. Please hit the subscribe button and also click on the bell icon for more notifications. Hi all. In the previous video we had a discussion on Alexander Pope episode 1 section 2 of Essay on Man. So we are back with another poem in the text which is prescribed for the University of Calicut for second semester BA English students, that is appreciating poetry. The author that we would be doing today is Stanley KUNITZ. I don't know whether you have heard of this poem. He was the poet laureate in the United States of America. He's an American writer. He's the 10th poet laureate of the United States of America. The most interesting fact of Stanley KUNITZ is that he lived for, I think, almost 100 years. We see that he was a very prolific writer, and he had published his works, especially poetry, even in the centenary year of his birth celebration, that is in the year 2005. He was born in 1905 to a Jewish descent family from Russia and Lithuania, and his father had committed suicide some 6 weeks before that he was born. The father's suicide actually played a significant role in Stanley KUNITZ's life. He committed suicide by consuming carbolic acid in a park, and this incident actually triggered or influenced his life and poetry at a later stage. Not in the beginning stage, but at a later stage. We see that there is the father personification done in various of his poems, in a variety of his poems, and this father figure is actually the figure that he turns to during his sad or tragic moments in life. Whenever he feels desolate, it is to his spirit that Stanley KUNITZ focuses his attention to. And we see that he commented that he has forsaken, that is, the father of Stanley KUNITZ has forsaken him, and he believes that his arrival might be the cause of his father's own destruction. It might have something to do with his intended arrival. That feeling is actually stricken to the mind of Stanley KUNITZ, and that feeling of thought actually implicates through his poetry. And it is after his birth, his mother actually raised her 3 children. He had 2 sisters also. He was the only male child in the family. He had married thrice. The last wife was a well-known American painter who had painted many of his poetry illustrations, and her name was Elise Asher. Stanley KUNITZ won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 1958, the year where he married Elise Asher, and he had problems in finding publishers as such. While asked about America's outlook to poetry, Stanley KUNITZ opined that America as a nation has never explored the true meaning of poetry. According to him, poetry should play a part of the fabric of the national life as such, but America hasn't done so yet. They have treated poetry as something peripheral or marginal in the system of society. And Stanley KUNITZ had this vision of writing poetry at a very early age, right from the age of 25 to be precise, and he says that he wrote poetry in order to improve the ways of teaching poetry in schools, as well as he says that poetry should be open to new sources of inspiration. When Stanley Kunitz was asked about how he looks through life, he quotes, let's just quote it from his own poem. He quotes it from his own poem that we are what we are, and only life surprises us. So everything that life comes up with is actually a surprising thing for Stanley Kunitz. And when asked about the most influential poets that made him write poetry, Stanley Kunitz opined that it was basically John Keats and Gerald Manley Hopkins that at first influenced him to write poetry as such. And he narrates a very good incident related to Gerald Manley Hopkins' influence. We say that Stanley Kunitz had his undergraduate program from Harvard College, and while he was walking through the Harvard Library and going through different stacks, he narrates that a book just fell in front of him. And when he noticed the book, it was a very fresh book, a book that was not touched by anyone before. And when he read the title of the book, it was a book that was written by Gerald Manley Hopkins in the year 1918. Stanley Kunitz just took the book and he started reading the poem God's Grandeur by Gerald Manley Hopkins. And by reading that, he was greatly influenced by the internal rhyme, the kind of spiritual energy that moved his poetry. And this spiritual energy affirmed in his mind that he would be writing poetry. He always knew that he would be a writer, and he would seek the form of poetry as the prime source of expressing his medium in art. The next writer that he talks of that he had influenced him in writing poetry right from the first starting stage was John Keats, the famous romantic English writer who lived just only for less than 30 years. And it is through his poetry, it is through his magnificence in or the eloquence of poetic thought that Stanley Kunitz was extremely influenced on. He has read an essay written by John Keats, and there is one particular phrase that moved him or that triggered him in writing his poems. And that phrase is the wholeness of the heart's affection. And poetry is something related to the wholeness of heart's affections. And this phrase triggered Stanley Kunitz in writing his poetry right from the start itself. His first poetry was also influenced by metaphysical writers like John Donne and Herbert, which focused on themes like time and eternity and the impact of relationships. And we see that during his early time, it was dense in imagery. As years proceeded, his poetry became simple, clear, and he says that there is a kind of song hidden in every poem that he has written. In fact, the critics said that he got better as years passed by. Usually we see that there is a general tendency of getting more critical as years go by. For example, the great romantic writer William Wordsworth had written some of his best poems when he was in his youth, and had written not famous or infamous poems when he reached the age of 80s. But that condition was just the opposite for Stanley Kunitz. As years proceeded, he had tremendous betterment of his poetry. He says that it was quite hard enough to write poetry at an adult age compared to writing poetry in youth, because he says that he has explored almost all things, and one needs to dig more deeper into the debris of life in order to get the content, the theme of a poem that he wishes to write. There is a search for a grand mythical source in his poem. He was greatly influenced in Carl Gustav Jung's philosophy of the collective unconscious and the mythic and the legend and all those terminologies. And he's often used these themes in his poem. There is a sense of time and eternity as well as Jungian symbolism that is reflected on Stanley Kunitz's poetry. So on the whole, he discusses on a variety of themes related to relationship, related to life, related to philosophy, related to nature. Concerning nature, he was a very good gardener. He had worked all sorts of jobs throughout his career. He was an assistant to a butcher shop, and he's also worked as a farmer. He has served as editor for the library, and he had criticized many librarians who were partial in their concern of publishing books. The poem that we have got to discuss is The Layers, that's written by Stanley Kunitz. The Layers is a kind of summing up poem for his collected of volumes of poems from 1928 to 1978. That's 50 years of writing poetry. He comes up with the different layers of his life. He talks about the past as a guide to the future, where he ponders upon his past and he makes certain changes for his future. And just as the title goes, his life is portrayed in the picture or the imagery of different layers. He focuses the different moments of life as different layers as such. And he narrates the richness and complexities of each layer in the category of free verse, which he later adopted in his poetry. So it is in free verse that the whole poem that we have got to study, The Layers, is written in. So let's just get into the poem in detail. I'll just read through the poem once, then we would go in for the explanation. The Layers by Stanley Kunitz. I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and am not who I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. When I look behind, as I am compelled to look before, I can gather strength to proceed on my journey. I see the milestone dwindling towards the horizon, and the slow fires exulting from the abandoned campsites, over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn, exulting somewhat, with my will intact to go wherever I need to go. And every stone on the road precious to me, in my darkest night, when the moon was covered and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus-clouded voice directed me, live in the layers and not on the litter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I'm not done with my changes. So that's a poem, The Layers by Stanley Kunitz. As a poem is not meant to be having a single reading as such, you can have different kinds of reading. I would be expressing my opinion related to the poem. As I said, this poem is actually a kind of summing up of his first 50 years, 1928 to 1978. The poem Layers actually is a kind of delivering an insight upon the speaker's life into the past, which triggers him to move forward in future. Let's look at the first few lines of the poem. I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and am not what I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. So, in the first line, I have walked through many lives, it may indicate two things according to my opinion. The first thing is that many people have come and have depended upon the lives of the speaker. So he might be talking about the various people that came through his life right from the start. The second is concerning his own experience. He's a man who has got a vivid kind of experience, especially in career base. Right. So there are two kind of reading for the people that have come to his life. Some of them my own indicates his own experience, and I am not who I was. Man always keeps on changing based on each circumstances that he faces in life. Though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. But for me, for the speaker, there is a principle behind his existence in this world, and that existence is actually meaningful to him. And there is a principle behind it, and I make it sure that I don't stray away from it, or I don't lose off the sight or lose off the path that I ought to go. So he's actually talking about his creativity skill of writing poetry. So there is a kind of existence for him, and that existence is conveyed in a meaningful manner through his poetry. Now let's look into the next lines. When I look behind, as I am compelled to look, before I can gather strength to proceed on my journey. It's a duty of every human being to look back to his past, and STANLEY KUNITZ also looks back to his past. He's saying that his past is filled with extremely difficult situations. For example, in the year 1959, soon after he receives the Pulitzer Prize, he is actually rejected by 8 publishers for publishing his third work in the year 1959. So he's trying to look back or look into his past, and he's saying that he's compelled to look in order to move forward. So everybody looks to their past or their experiences in past in order to move forward in future. I see the milestones dwindling towards the horizon. I see the milestones dwindling. Milestone indicate my achievements dwindling towards the horizon. Dwindling means slowly diminishing. He might be talking about his old age right now. He might be talking of death, the symbol of death as such. As he gets older, he is not achieving the same kind of vigor that he used to write poetry in his youth. And the slow fires trailing in the sense that I had my achievements in the past, and I had my positive things in the past, and that positive things are slowly diminishing from the abandoned campsites. So these are all a kind of memory. Abandoned campsites in the sense these are all memories right now. I cannot get back to my glorious past, over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. For me, they are like scavenger angels. Those memories are like scavenger angels. Scavenger means people who pick on dirty things. Angels indicate something that's precious. He's actually picking up certain memories of his past that he thinks had faced difficulties in a very positive manner. Wheel on heavy wings, and that instances might be heavy as such. Heavy in the sense it might be a kind of a burden for us. Wheel indicate the wheel of time. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. Tribe indicates a group of people. Now, Carl Gustav Jung's collective unconscious say that there is a kind of connection between a community or group of people, and he focuses on that connection in writing poetry. His writing style is connected with various other kinds of poets that he has come across in life, that has influenced upon his life, and he has created his own style of writing poetry that indicates his own tribe of poetry. Right. Out of my true affections, my true meanings, it is through his life experience that he has created his poetry, and that experience comes from within his heart, from within the meaning of his life. And my tribe is scattered. I have written many poetry in life all through these 50 years. It is scattered. There are many poems that I can ponder upon. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? So at many times in my life, I have come across losses. I have lost my father before I was born, and he has a series of losses right from the start itself. And he's thinking about his losses and how can his heart be reconciled. There is a rhetorical question that is being asked by Stanley KUNITZ here. How can the heart be reconciled? How can I have a kind of happiness? Or how can I make my life move forward rather than thinking or dwelling upon these past losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. So in the past, I have seen many of my friends who have turned into dust, and they were actually anxious people. They were people who had ambitions in their life, and all these ambitions were struck with the blow of death, and death stops everything, right? And there is a sense of recognition of the permanent loss that is there in the speaker's mind. Even though there are achievements in my life, I have come across many losses, and those losses are acting like stings on my face. Sting is something that you prick on your face, where you have a certain small bit of pain in your face. Yet I turn. So this is a turning point here. This line happens to be the turning point of the poem. Rather than dwelling upon the losses that I have faced in my life, but I have turned from it. Each time I think of the losses, I just kept on moving forward. Yet I turn, exulting somewhat with my will intact to go. So there is a will inside me. I have a very good willpower, and that willpower inside me is the thing that keeps on making me move forward. So the willpower that we have talked of in Milton's poem on his blindness, and the willpower that we talked of Nazim Hikmat's poem in the advices given. So all these things are interconnected. So willpower in yourself is a thing that you need to focus on, and that focus has made me move forward, exulting somewhat, with my will intact to go wherever I need to go. And it is through my willpower that I happen to go through the journey of my life. I have reached here, and I am satisfied with where I am. That's the general impact. And every stone on the road precious to me. And every stone on the road, stone here symbolizes the rough time, the difficult times of his life. On the road means on the journey of life. So there are many stones, there are obstacles, there are difficulties that the poet has faced in his journey of life, and all are precious to me. Why precious to me? Because it is through these stones that I understand what are my weaknesses, what are my strengths, and I gather all the strength to move forward. In my darkest night in the sense it's also a symbolic image here. So there are lots of images that's been discussed in this point. Darkest night indicates the most difficult time when the moon was covered. When the moon was covered means there was no sign of hope as such. There was no sign of hope. I was utterly depressed, and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus clouded voice. And I roamed through wreckage. I was suffering the most terrible times of my life, and there was someone who was actually calling me. He might be assuming it to be the spirit of his father. Live in the layers, not on the litter. Live in the layers. So you need to live every layer of your life rather than ponder upon all the negative thoughts that come onto your mind related to the past. You need to live each layer to its fullest. Every life aspect has to be enjoyed, whether it be sadness, whether it be happiness. Though I lack the art to decipher it, here KUNITZ is having a kind of a metapoetic moment wherein he is acknowledging the limitation of his art form, that is poetry. The speaker is unable to use language to accurately describe or convey what his future existence would be, because the future has not happened yet. In the same way that he was able to describe the past, he cannot describe the future in the similar manner that he has described the past. No doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I'm not done with my changes. So I know that as I move forward, I have the willpower to move forward. I know that as I move forward, there are going to be changes that is happening to my life, both physically as well as mentally. And I know that these changes are not going to end as I move forward in life. So he's accepting life with both his hands. Stanley KUNITZ, even though has faced many difficulties in his life, in the earlier stages of his life, we see that he's accepting. That is why, that may be the cause of him writing poetry even in the 100th year, in his centenary. There is no stopping of writing poetry by Stanley KUNITZ. So there are lots of symbols and images discussed in the poem as such. You need to just focus on those symbols and images. So to sum up the entire poem, the poet here has described life in different layers, right from the start to the present situation. He says that throughout his life he has witnessed lots of experience. He had learned through lots of experiences, and that experiences has provided him both sadness and happiness. And we see that it is sadness more that is being provided rather than happiness. But the willpower that he has in his mind actually makes him move forward in life, and every bit of layer that his life experiences, he becomes a changed man, a man that has changed from the mistakes that he has committed in the previous layer. I hope that you have understood the poem The Layers by Stanley KUNITZ. If you have any doubts, you can drop in your doubts in the comment box below. Till then, it's me, Danish, signing off. Have a good day. Learn with Danish.